focus on what matters.
Welcome to the State of Socioeconomic Mobility virtual event. I'm Hope King, business reporter at Axios. I'm coming to you from New York, New York. Thank you to Capital One for making this conversation possible. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. Join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and hashtag Axios Events. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll dive into the long-standing barriers to achieving socioeconomic mobility that persist as the economy inches toward recovery in the wake of the pandemic. Our first guest is a Democratic candidate for Maryland governor and also the former CEO at Robin Hood Foundation, Wes Moore, joining us from Baltimore, Maryland. Hello, Wes.
Hope, it's great to see you again. Thank you so much.
It's always great to see you. And I want to first start off by asking you about your economic pathway for all Marylanders. You have quite a few specific policies here. I'd love for you to share those with us.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons that I was so excited to think about the economics of this moment is this is a core part of the why I entered into the governor's race in the first place. Is, we have a tremendous state, but it is just also remarkably inequitable. And we see how that inequity shows itself throughout so many different facets of our society. But no place do we see it more in the way that we look at economic opportunity and how unfairly apportioned economic opportunity is. Because the reality is that economic opportunity is readily available to some. It is just dangerously absent to others. And part of our platform really is about how can we address equity, and particularly when it comes to the economy. And so I was, very proud to recently release our plan for unlocking economic opportunity for Maryland's Black families, because one of the things that we continue to see is that you watch how these discrepancies show itself in communities and in populations in Maryland, where we know we have a chance to create measures of growth, but that growth should be inclusive. That growth should be a growth plan that benefits all families in the state, because it will benefit all families in the state.
One of the challenges from the economic recovery is there have been some immediate benefits and some stimulus packages that are now going away. And a lot of people are wondering, how do you continue that momentum? What are your key plans to do so?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that COVID had just laid bare the inequities and the systemic failures that have festered long before the pandemic. What we saw from COVID was not just simply an exacerbation of these inequities. It was also an exposure. And I think when we're thinking about what the recovery needs to look like and how we need to think about our capital and these new capital resources that are going to be placed inside of our communities, we need to think about them as investments that we know is going to create a measurable return on our larger societal benefit. Investing in the infrastructure needs that we know have been long-standing challenges. Investing in our schools that we know have been creating mechanisms where we, for example, in the state of Maryland, have some of the best schools in the country. Yet at the same time, 2 weeks ago, we had schools in Baltimore City close at noon because of a lack of air conditioning, or schools in Frederick or Carroll County in the rural parts of the state that were closed due to rain. These are inequities that we know that this stimulus package that we have on board now are going to be important to be able to address. So in the state of Maryland, we have around a $2.5 billion surplus. If you look at how that can be actualized over the next 2 years, that number rises to almost potentially projected of $5 billion. And we've had elected officials who have said, well, that shows that we have weathered the storm. But who has weathered the storm? And on whose backs are we continuing to weather the storm? We can make core concrete investments in our infrastructure, in our education system, and our transportation mechanisms that's putting equity as the lens in which we're making the decisions, and long-term sustainable economic mobility and returns as the thing that we know are going to be how we're thinking about the course of the future for our state.
I mean, you talked about a lot of things there, and infrastructure is one thing, obviously, at a national, federal level, that there's been a lot of debate around how much should be invested in this. But also, at a local level, we're seeing workers all across the country feeling more empowered to leave their jobs, and much more so in these hourly worker, categories in retail and restaurant and bars. What do you think is the way that companies can really incentivize, but really from a long-term perspective, how do they help these employees want to stay in these jobs, to take on these jobs, and not to consider, other forms of employment?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to also see which industries are we watching this significant disruption in. They've also been industries that we've seen significant disruption in the way they went about their work over the past 2 years. Where we're seeing a lot of these mechanisms are in industries such as hospitality, what were some of the hardest hit industries that we saw during COVID? It was in areas of the hotel business, restaurant business, et cetera, hospitality businesses. And frankly, those were also businesses where we watched a significant amount of the working poor in which they worked, in which they exist. How many families did we have who lost their jobs due to COVID-19 were living in poverty before COVID-19, i.e., the working poor? People who were working jobs, in some cases, multiple jobs, and still living below the poverty line. These are things that we have to be able to address and to know that when we're talking about what is going to be good for business or what is going to be good for workers, that those do not and should not be mutually exclusive conversations. That we should be focusing on economic growth. We should be supporting and focusing on how we're bringing jobs to our communities and making sure that the small businesses and the micro businesses that are here, that they are staying, and the ones that we need here, that we are recruiting. Yet at the same time, we've got to make sure we have a core focus on supporting our workers, and hence also why the North Star for my administration is going to be on 3 issues. It's going to be focusing on work, wages, and wealth. And how do we go about the process of creating pathways for all 3 of those things, work, wages, and wealth, for all families in the state of Maryland?
So let's talk about the work aspect. And, we were looking at, again, some of the worst industries being affected by this, as you mentioned, because of the fears of COVID, because they couldn't take time off, maybe to take care of family members. What are your specific strategies to help level the, basically the values of the companies that they obviously want to stay in business, but also employ these workers? What's the solution here to get people back to work safely and to really help these businesses out?
I think there's a few things that the state specifically can do to not just help the workers get back to work, but also in turn help the businesses to get their employers back inside of the workplace. We have to put a core focus on childcare. And we have to ensure that every family in the state of Maryland has access to affordable and quality childcare to support the disproportionate women, and specifically disproportionate women and minority populations that are pushed out of the workforce due to a lack of access. We can't have a return to work strategy if we do not also have a childcare strategy in the way we are going to be dealing with that. We have to think about the ways we're going to leverage higher education and in our state, leverage our world-class historically Black colleges and universities, our trade schools, our community colleges, and really using them as pipelines for opportunity, but places where we're partnering the private sector with these institutions of higher education and our K-12 system to make sure we're addressing the fact that we have such a discrepancy between the amount of jobs that are available and the people who are then qualified to fill them. We have to focus on job training and expanding our apprenticeship programs of our underrepresented groups to give better access to high-paying jobs of the future. And for our state, really positioning Maryland to meet the challenges of tech and nursing and manufacturing labor shortages, because as you mentioned earlier, those shortages are real. And one thing that we are going to be doing within our administration is we are going to develop the first ever statewide service year program that will create a valuable experience and a pathway to college affordability for our high school graduates, because this is a way for our high school graduates to feel a sense of stickiness to the ways that they can be part of the solution set that our state needs. And at the same time, being able to address the fact that we have a college affordability crisis, not just in the state of Maryland, but around the country, that still needs to be addressed. And there's a pathway that we can address both of those 2 issues.
You have a personal story that I think really sets you apart from the other candidates, but also you were the former CEO of Robin Hood Foundation, which is one of the largest anti-poverty nonprofits in the country. What have you learned through those experiences running the foundation, maybe in your personal life, that really helps you understand where those solutions need to come from?
Now, I've had a chance to be a chief executive and to lead in a variety of different segments of the American economy, whether it was leading soldiers in combat as a paratrooper in Afghanistan, or running a successful small business here in Maryland, where we help students make it to and through college, students who are first and family and first generation students. But then also, yes, I mean, being the CEO of one of the largest anti-poverty nonprofits in this country. And I think there were a couple of big points that I led with. One is, as a leader, I am data-driven and heart-led. Data matters. Being able to make not emotive decisions, but decisions based on what the data is showing you about what works, what things can scale, and then making sure we're investing in it and scaling them. And also at the same time, one of the big lessons learned is one of the reasons that I'm in this race is that if we are not fixing the systems that continue to allow people to fall between the cracks, then it is never going to be enough to clean up the debris that comes from broken systems. Coming up with strong, structured, and people-centered public institutions, that is the pathway that we are going to create equity, is the pathway that we are going to create fairness, and it's the pathway that we can create inclusive growth.
I think that's really well said. Wes, thank you so much for sharing your insights and strategies with us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Good to see you. And next, we have a View from the Top segment with my colleague, SVP of Creative Strategy and Events at Axios, Kristen Burkhalter.
Thanks, Hope. I'd now like to introduce Andy Navarrete, who is the Executive Vice President, Head of External Affairs at Capital One. Hi, Andy. Welcome to Axios.
Hi, Kristen. Thank you for having me.
Of course, looking forward to a great conversation. Metrics like the monthly jobs report, the federal interest rate, and the consumer price index provide some national insights into the current financial state of Americans. And according to Axios reporting, the pandemic has dealt a devastating blow to working women, with nearly 2 million dropping out of the labor force, in many cases because they were disproportionately saddled with housework and childcare duties. But I probably don't need to tell you all of this data, because data and analytics is something that you think about each and every day. So much so that you and I have some exciting things we're going to talk about today. So let's jump straight in. Tell us more about the Capital One Insight Center and why you and your team are launching it.
Absolutely. And Kristen, I think it's best to start maybe with a little bit of context and history, which is, unlike most financial institutions, Capital One is relatively young. We're only about a quarter of a century old. And so our CEO often likes to joke that most banks had a 100-year head start on us. I think the reason that that's significant is because our business model is actually quite unique. We, unlike most banks, started with a focus on underserved communities, using data and analytics to better determine whether we could bring these underserved constituencies into the financial mainstream. And so with those capabilities that we have built over the years, they've been obviously key drivers of our strategy. But over time, what we learned is that data was actually also very helpful in painting a very complete and fulsome picture of the state of the American consumer. And so we found ourselves dialoguing with policymakers, with academics, and with our community partners in ways that help them glean insight from the state of the American consumer and drive some of the choices that they were making. And so fast forward to COVID, where we needed to double down on those capabilities to really understand on a daily basis what was going on in the country and how this might affect our business and our communities. And so, as we were launching the Capital One Insights Center, we were thinking about our Capital One Impact Initiative, which was our $200 million 5-year commitment to advancing socioeconomic mobility, and saw the intersections between what we were analyzing for strategic reasons and what we were and could communicate to the outside world in terms of some of this, analytical insight. And so we decided to more formally, brand those efforts and created the Capital One Insight Center as a means of doing that.
And speaking of data and analytics, as part of the launch, you released the Capital One Marketplace Index Road to Recovery, which calls attention to the unequal economic impact of the pandemic, as you mentioned, and the continued challenges for key underrepresented groups. So in your eyes, what were the 3 top takeaways?
I think the key takeaway number one is that we should, as a society, be looking not just at the unemployment numbers, but the underemployment numbers. And so I think this is a phenomenon that obviously predates the pandemic, where there are instances where individuals, for a variety of reasons, weren't able to partake of full employment in a way that met their personal and professional needs. That, like many other dynamics in our society, was greatly exacerbated by the pandemic. And so across the three segments that we were analyzing, low earners, those making less than $25,000 a year, middle earners making $50,000 to $100,000 a year, and higher earners making over $100,000 a year, you saw unemployment or underemployment be a pervasive phenomenon across the board. We started this analysis back in March of 2020, and so we've been able to look at the longitudinal picture of the health of the consumer. And while it is positive to note that among higher earners and middle earners, we have progressed to a place where the underemployment numbers are substantially lower, it has remained persistent and static in the lower earner bucket. And so that is one area that we are looking very closely at, and that we hope policymakers, others studying this phenomenon, can better understand and ground as well. Number two was that we saw the state of financial anxiety and financial well-being again cross the spectrum of earners, but again, much more pervasive in the lower earner segment, and in particular in communities of color. And so, there have been green shoots of progress, again, in people feeling a little bit more financially stable. Certainly, stimulus and some of the government action has been targeted in a way that has addressed some of those needs. But as unemployment insurance and stimulus and other factors have been taken out of the equation, we are watching very closely the state of lower earners in this space, because that is another place where the disproportionate impact is still being felt and hasn't really progressed since the start of the pandemic. Nevertheless, we are looking at some positive metrics as well. And so the third key finding for us was that for middle earners and higher earners, substantial portions of those populations have been able to increase their savings. And so that is something that we hope creates more resilience for the American consumer and helps them continue to navigate this pandemic in a way that can maintain their financial well-being.
Thanks for that. And staying on the theme of recovery, what does a more inclusive economic recovery look like? And what data and trends help us determine if those lower earners that you mentioned, women and people of color, if they are experiencing a true recovery?
Well, what we absolutely want to see is this data drive more grounded discussions at the public policy level. And so there are any number of things that we as an individual corporation can do to help our 52,000 associates, including providing health benefits and childcare and other necessary infrastructural elements to support people's abilities to work at the level that they desire. We need government, I think, to look at those issues as well. And so as debates go on at the federal level, in particular around what social infrastructure may look like, we think that some of the root causes of underemployment, most notably the lack of childcare, where we see a disproportionate impact on women workers relative to men, and again, a disproportionate impact for communities of color, that these are areas that the policymakers who are debating what social infrastructure will look like can hopefully glean some insights that may help drive some of the solutions they ultimately adopt.
Thanks, Andy, for this conversation. And thank you, Capital One, for sponsoring this worthy event.
I'm Russell Contreras, the race and justice reporter here at Axios. Our final guest is the executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Ai-jen Poo, joining us from Washington, D.C. Ai-jen, it's great to have you. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me, Russ. I'm doing well, working on trying to move the Build Back Better agenda forward, as many people in this town are, and a lot happening right now, especially on this topic.
Before we get into the current legislation pending in Congress, take us back into the world of the domestic worker in the past 18 months. Obviously, there's no virtual platform for the domestic worker. They can't work from home while also taking care of the elder or taking care of children. What has life been for the domestic worker these past 18 months?
It's been a crisis of impossible choices for domestic workers. We're talking about 2.2 million, mostly women, majority women of color who work inside of our homes. And they work in isolated conditions and earn poverty wages without access to a safety net. People were working paycheck to paycheck to begin with without any kind of savings. So when the stay-at-home orders came down, we saw dramatic losses in jobs and income and immediate food insecurity issues. People were making really tough choices in the early weeks of the pandemic between gas and essential needs, phone bills to keep their kids connected to online learning. It was just an incredible crisis. You also saw people who were continuing to work as essential workers, like home care workers, who were, in many cases, the only lifeline to some of the people most vulnerable to the COVID virus itself: older people, people with disabilities. And so you saw home care workers paying out of pocket for safer modes of transportation to minimize exposure to the virus itself, paying out of pocket for PPE, all the while their own kids home from school, struggling with online learning, needing childcare, their own loved ones also needing care. And the average annual income of a home care worker in this country is $18,000 per year. So imagine what that must have been like for those essential workers who we celebrated and applauded, but to this day, we still haven't raised wages for. And by the way, 82% of all domestic workers came into the pandemic without a single paid sick day. So in terms of the ability to keep yourself safe and healthy, even as you attempt to continue working as an essential worker in a pandemic, it is a struggle.
How have you been able to change this conversation? Because before the pandemic, the country seemed to be celebrating that we hit our lowest federal poverty rate in decades. But yet the domestic worker, that's something that may not resonate with these workers, because not only were they straddling the federal poverty line, but they were also underemployed. How do you change that conversation from the celebratory atmosphere we had just a few months ago, that we were defeating poverty, to saying, hey, wait, no, we have still people who are struggling with low income?
I think the pandemic actually revealed for all to see that even before there was a pandemic, there was an epidemic of low wage work in America, where you had millions of people working incredibly hard and still not able to make ends meet, still not able to save enough. There were all these surveys that came out that showed that a majority of working people are struggling in terms of being able to weather any kind of emergency. And so I think it revealed just how many people were working paycheck to paycheck without access to a real safety net, and how many of those workers are actually essential. The delivery workers, the grocery workers, the warehouse workers, the restaurant workers. These are farm workers. These are workers who we largely took for granted would continue to work for poverty wages. We now understand just how essential they are. And what we have is a once in a generation opportunity to invest in this work becoming good work. And I'm thinking specifically in the care sector, we have the opportunity to invest in care jobs becoming family sustaining jobs for the 21st century, a once in several generations opportunity to transform poverty wage work into good work with real economic mobility.
Now, many anti-poverty activists I speak would say, look, today, if you're in poverty, it's harder to get out of poverty and move into the middle class than it was, say, 50 years ago. Your organization is really pushing some of the proposals right now in Congress around the Build Back America agenda. How will those proposals help domestic workers struggle to get out of poverty and to struggle to get out of this cycle of low wage work?
Well, if you look at the caregiving policy agenda alone within the Build Back Better plan, we're talking about making childcare, quality childcare, affordable and accessible. We're talking about creating a national paid family and medical leave program so that you can take time off from work to take care of your own health or that of a loved one, including spending time with a newborn child without having to lose income. We're talking about investing in home and community-based care for our aging population and our loved ones with disabilities. And we're talking about raising wages for care workers to make sure that these jobs become good jobs. All of those plans, all of those proposals can make a transformative difference in the lives of workers like domestic workers who are majority primary income earners for their families. They're also majority mothers of young children and need childcare even as they go to work to care for others as their profession. And the fact that that we could potentially make caregiving jobs that can't be outsourced and are not going to be automated anytime soon. These are jobs that are here to stay and are going to be a huge share of the jobs of the future. We have the opportunity to make sure that they are jobs that create real economic security for the workers who do them, so that the workforce that we're relying upon to help take care of us and our families and enable us to return to the workforce and work in all kinds of professions across industries, that they can sustain and take care of their own families too. And what I always say about the care economy is that these jobs are job enabling jobs. It is not an accident that we've started to talk about the care economy as infrastructure, because if the definition of infrastructure is that which enables the economy and society to function, what could be more fundamental than care, than childcare, than paid leave, than home and community care for our aging loved ones and loved ones with disabilities? Even the men who will be building bridges and tunnels as a part of our bipartisan infrastructure legislation, those men need care in order to work. And so it is essential that we begin to invest in these caregiving programs, and it will have ripple effects across the economy, really securing the foundation of what American workers need in order to work.
You've also been very outspoken that the language around domestic work needs to change. Your organizers, when you organize and unionize workers, there's no Walmart, there's no Amazon to go against. These are private families. And it's difficult to say, look, your system of wages and pain are part of a systemic racism and a systemic inequality system right here that needs to be addressed. You say you need to change that language in order for change. Why is that important?
It's important because I think what we've had historically is a dynamic where we think about our caregiving responsibilities as a personal burden, a personal responsibility. And if we somehow can't afford the care we need, or we can't find or manage the care we need, it is a personal failure. And I think what we've all come to realize in the pandemic is that we need collective solutions. We need public policy, programs, a strong workforce to support us. And that is a collective endeavor. It is not a crisis of personal failures. It is a failure of our infrastructure and our public policy to support the caregiving needs of families, including investing in a strong care workforce. So this is about us investing in the public good, just like infrastructure, public schools, roads, bridges, broadband. This is essential that we have collective solutions in the 21st century economy.
In our final 60 seconds here, can you describe who the majority of these domestic workers are? You mentioned they are mothers, but who else are they?
The nannies, the house cleaners, the home care workers who support our families are 92% women, majority women of color, Black, Latina, API, Indigenous, and it's an industry with a really high concentration of immigrant workers. In fact, the largest concentration of undocumented immigrant workers are working inside of our own homes, making it possible for our loved ones to have the care, the support, the independence, and the dignity that they need, and really fundamental. And I think when we talk about issues like immigration, it becomes extracted from the humans and the relationships that are actually our reality when it comes to immigration. We are so interdependent with millions of immigrant women who we rely on for some of our most fundamental needs in our society and our economy. And that work and those people deserve recognition, protections, and living wage jobs so that they can also take care of their own families.
Ai-jen Poo, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. And thank you to our sponsor, Capital One, for making this event possible. For more information or to sign up for our Axios Closer or Axios Latino newsletters, visit axios.com/newsletters or go to our Axios app. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you soon on axios.com.